fourth and final event of this series is on achieving impact in a challenging financial context. And it's happening online on Tuesday, the 8th of July from 12:30 till 2. As some housekeeping, most of this is covered on the slide that you can see, but this event is recorded and it'll be sent out in a follow-up email along with any kind of slides and resources afterwards. We're hopefully going to leave lots of time for Q&A, so please do put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. It's a different box to the chat, but if you do post it in the chat, we'll make it work. So by way of introductions, I'm James Somerville. I'm head of policy at NPC and I lead our policy and influencing work. We're almost a year into this Labour government and we've seen some quite promising shifts in how the government wants to engage with charities and civil society. We've seen Number 10 set up the partnership unit. The Treasury's social impact investing advisory group is well underway. We're expecting Number 10 and DCMS to publish the civil society covenant soon, which I know Beatrice is going to speak more about. But at the same time, lots of charities haven't seen the policy change that they might have hoped for under the Labour government when there was the change. So campaigning and advocacy is still a really important part of what charities and civil society do. Historically, there's obviously been a lot of criticism of charity campaigning, and that hasn't entirely stopped under this government. Wes Streeting criticised charity campaigning, I think, days after the covenant was announced. So it still can be really hard to know when and how to campaign. And today we're hoping to build your confidence around this. To let us know a bit more about who's joined today, a poll should be appearing on your screen now, hopefully, with a couple of questions. So if you could fill those in, that would be great.
Sorry, James, can we come back to the poll?
Pardon? We'll come back to the poll.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, in which case, I'm going to hand over to Beatrice. So Beatrice was most recently head of policy and public affairs at the Refugee Council and joined NCVO in summer last year after a stint working for the Labour Party on the general election campaign. She previously worked at the Financial Conduct Authority on Brexit and their consumer principle and was a special advisor to Hilary Benn for 7 years. So Beatrice, do you mind kicking things off by giving us a bit of a sense of the political landscape and your reflections on the kinds of things that trustees should prioritise?
Thanks, James, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion today. As you said, James, it's been nearly a year since the general election brought a new Labour government to power, and already the political landscape is shifting, not just because of who's in charge, but because of how people across the country are responding to politics more broadly. Reform is on the rise. The Tory party, once the dominant force in British politics, is in something close to existential meltdown. And while Labour has a huge majority, it's governing in a climate that's economically tight, politically febrile, and crucially deeply sceptical. And that's where trustees have a vital role to play, not just in helping their charities show up with clarity, confidence, and purpose, but also in pushing their organisations to be politically agile, to understand the big strategic picture and not just the policy detail. So while Labour is settling into government, a new political force is gaining ground. Reform UK, under Nigel Farage's leadership, is experiencing a sharp rise in support. Recent polling suggests that if a general election was held today, Reform could command as much as 19 to 22% of the national vote. And in some polls, they've overtaken the Tories to become the de facto opposition in terms of vote share, especially in parts of the North and East Midlands. This surge reflects a growing sense of public dissatisfaction with traditional parties and institutions and a desire for alternative voices that challenge the political consensus. Reform's messaging on immigration, public services, and woke politics is resonating in communities that feel disempowered or disillusioned. Even if they don't win many seats under our electoral system, they are already shaping the debate. That includes more pressure on charities to justify their voice in public life, especially if they work with minoritized communities, asylum seekers, or in areas that some now view as politically controversial. The Tories are facing deep internal turmoil and diminishing public support. Under Kemi Badenoch's leadership, the party has suffered heavy losses in local elections, including all 16 councils where it previously held a majority. Recent polling shows only 10% of voters now consider the Tories a strong party, while 61% view them as weak. Reform is seen as more decisive, more aligned with public anger, and in some polls, more trustworthy. There is active discontent within Conservative ranks, with some MPs openly speculating about a potential leadership challenge before Badenoch's first anniversary in post. So I think it's no exaggeration to say that the party faces an existential crisis. And while our work at NCVO focuses on national systems and local communities, we cannot lose sight of the global forces shaping our future. Trustees today need to think globally, even as they act locally. So take the example of refugees, one close to my heart. If we believe we are facing a challenge now with the rise of parties like Reform shaping the political climate, we must recognise that we are only at the beginning of this change. Climate change will bring displacement on a scale we've not yet seen. Water supplies will dry up. Entire communities, many of them living at or near sea level, will be forced to move. Much of this migration will happen within countries, but some of it will spill across borders, and when it does, it will test our politics, our institutions, and our values. And this is not just a matter for governments or international agencies, it's a challenge for civil society and for trustees, because we are the ones helping communities prepare, adapt, and respond. The decisions we make today, even at a local level, must be made with an eye to that global future. But back to the domestic. Reform is gaining serious momentum. While the Tories face near total collapse, Labour may hold a commanding majority, but it's operating in an era of economic constraint, political volatility, and growing public distrust. We should not underestimate this. The civic space in the UK is narrowing in subtle but serious ways, and trustees need to be alert to the risks and prepared to defend the legitimate right of charities to speak truth to power. In this context, the question of how charities influence power and how trustees support that work feels more urgent than ever. So let's start with where the government is now on its approach to civil society. So Labour came into office promising a more collaborative relationship with civil society. And we saw that early commitment in the Civil Society Covenant, a framework introduced in October last year, aim at resetting and strengthening the relationship between government and the voluntary sector. The Covenant is political, symbolic, and practical. It's not a piece of legislation, but it does matter because it outlines shared expectations about how government and civil society can work together in a spirit of respect, trust, and partnership. To make a difference, the covenant needs to have key features, including strong protection of our right to campaign, so we can both partner and challenge, robust accountability mechanisms to ensure progress, and it needs to push local authorities, not just central government departments, to improve their relationship with civil society. So why should trustees care about the covenant? Well, it sends a political signal that advocacy and challenge are part of a healthy democracy, and it gives charities a reference point if partnerships start to drift or falter. But meeting this moment depends on boards being equipped to lead. And right now, too many are operating with gaps, particularly in areas like policy, communications, and finance. Data from last year's Trustees Week report shows that these shortfalls are slowing progress, especially for organisations working on politically sensitive issues. For some, trusteeship is beginning to feel unsustainable. We need to challenge that perception and show why strong, skilled boards are essential to resilience and influence. Nearly a year in, Labour's tone is still constructive. We're seeing engagement at multiple levels, real interest in delivery partnership, and a willingness for ministers to listen. But And this is crucial. The political bandwidth is narrow. This is a government that wants big change fast, but without big money to spend. They want reform without spending and delivery without delay. That creates opportunities for charities, but also pressure, especially when it comes to policy influence. So where do trustees come in? The role of trustees in shaping influencing work has always been important, but right now it's critical because in a moment where every word is scrutinized, credibility matters, clarity matters, and confidence matters. These three qualities, credibility, clarity, and confidence, are what a strong board can and should provide. Credibility. Trustees bring a governance lens. They look long term. They challenge assumptions. Clarity. Trustees can help organizations cut through the noise. What are we trying to change and who needs to hear it? Confidence. When a board understands the mission and backs the strategy, it gives staff the freedom to act boldly and responsibly. And let's be honest, it's a tense time to be campaigning. As I've already said, reform is polling in double digits. The culture wars are alive and well, and some politicians, even within Labour, remain uneasy with charities that speak out too loudly. While the legal framework for charity campaigning, including Charity Commission guidance and electoral law, hasn't changed dramatically, the tone and risk have. The Commission itself has been clear. Campaigning is a legitimate and often essential route to achieving charitable aims. But in practice, we've seen increased scrutiny of charity speech, media pylons, and a growing perception, especially online, that advocacy equals bias. This is where trustees must lead with balance and bravery, because excessive caution can lead to silence, but recklessness can do real harm. That's why trustees need to be clear, not just on what the organisation is saying, but also why it's saying it and how that aligns with mission and values. The civil society covenant, while not enforceable, can still be a powerful tool. It gives us something to point to, a shared agreement, a political signal, a moral commitment. But the legal foundation already exists. Trustees should be confident that speaking out is not just allowed, it's expected where it advances charitable purpose. That includes political challenge when it aligns with mission, and it's up to us, staff and trustees alike, to hold government to that standard. A word on scale. It's tempting to focus our influencing work on Westminster, but increasingly power is devolved to mayors, combined authorities, integrating sets, care systems. Labour has made it clear that place matters, and that means trustees need to think not just about national profile, but local presence. Are we building relationships with the right people in our local systems? Are our staff empowered to influence in those spaces? And we must be especially mindful of small charities, many of which rely heavily on local government for income. Our Almanac data shows that smaller organisations receive a disproportionate share of their funding from councils, meaning they're acutely exposed to Section 114 notices, budget cuts, and shifts in local priorities. A recent procurement notice has encouraged more spending with small charities, which is welcome, but unless public spending grows, the risks remain. Local policy changes could also affect community arts, SEND provision, and grassroots groups, the very organisations that hold local leaders to account. Small Charity Week, which we have coming up, is an opportunity to show just how much local communities value them. Influencing shouldn't sit in a single department. It should be woven through the organisation, and trustees have a role in making that happen. It's also a moment for boards to reflect on governance itself. NCVO has recently consulted on a refreshed charity governance code, a practical framework trustees can use to strengthen their role, especially around strategic leadership and risk. So what should trustees be doing right now? Well, here are 5 questions every board should ask. 1, do we have a clear strategy for influencing, not just vague goals, a plan that aligns with your mission? 2, are we confident in the legal and regulatory environment? Do we understand the Charity Commission rules? Are we ready for pre-election period? Some way off, but worth bearing in mind. 3, are we investing in relationships locally and nationally? Influence is about trust. Are we cultivating it with those stakeholders? 4, are we listening to the people we serve? Real stories, lived experience. That's what makes influencing powerful and legitimate. 5, are we learning from what we do? How do we know if our influencing is effective? Are we evaluating, adapting, improving? To close, I want to return to this moment we're in. The country is in flux, politics is shifting, people are tired of old answers and deeply skeptical of new ones. Yes, that creates volatility, but also space. As trustees, you have a crucial role to play in defending civic space, in supporting brave and thoughtful advocacy, and in helping your organisations make the case for change. Because what we do as charities is political, not partisan, but political. It's about power. And if we care about outcomes, about poverty, injustice, and inequality, then we have to be prepared to speak out and act. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Beatrice. Loads to pick up in there, including your brief mention of devolution in place, which we've already had a question on. So we'll come back to that. But before that, we're going to hand over to Delroy. Delroy is a strategic consultant and expert in improving impact for vulnerable groups and consumers across technology, privacy, and financial services. He has a wealth of cross-sector experience, having held senior roles in public affairs, philanthropy, and corporate strategy, as well as founding the Financial Inclusion Centre and the Black Footballers Partnership, where he's currently the executive director. We're also very lucky at MPC to have Delroy on our board of trustees, where he supports our influencing work. So, Delroy, do you mind kind of reflecting a bit on different approaches to influencing policy and kind of the differences between doing that in your day-to-day job versus as a trustee?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, James. As you know, we have a very strong board at MPC, so it could have been any one of the trustees who could be given this presentation. And also, thank you, Beatrice, for that 10-minute canter through very important subject areas. For us trustees, I have to say, we need all the support we can get in taking forward the aims and objectives of our organisation. So, and NCVO's work is very important for doing that. I think, James, the intro you gave me was quite good. And I think for those people who are listening in, who probably have never met me before, many people haven't met me before, it might be good just to give you my background in terms of being a trustee and why I'm a trustee, and then moving on into the influencing space. I mean, I'm a trustee, as James says, at MPC, but I'm also a trustee at an organisation called the Daniel Phelan Trust. Daniel Phelan Trust aims to get more diverse people into journalism. I'm also a trustee at High Trees Community Trust, which is like a jobs, education, and training community trust near to where I live. I'm also on the board of an organisation called the Registry Trust, which looks at public data for public good in terms of county court judgments and so on. And I was previously on the board of Terence Higgins Trust. And I was on the board of Terence Higgins Trust for a number of reasons. One of them is, I believe, we have a more inclusive health sector, help people improve their lives and bring change. Now, I say all of that because, as James pointed out, I have a background in policy and communications, government relations and strategy. So it was interesting to hear Beatrice say we need more of people like me. When actually I look around my board table, I think we need more of people who don't look like me, who don't come from my background. But it's interesting that Beatrice should say that, because in this environment, which I will come on to in terms of my view on the new political landscape, we do need to think very much as trustees about how we are campaigning and bringing the voice of our clients, the people that we represent, into the debate. And I'll give you an example. I've done it in my professional life, as well as my life as a trustee. One of my earliest jobs was working at an organisation called Which, many of you will know, it used to be called Consumers Association. And when I worked there, we had a very dynamic CEO who wanted us to be more campaign focused at a time when I would say Other organisations weren't perhaps as campaign focused as they could have been. And one of the things we wanted to do was take legal action against a financial services firm that we felt wasn't delivering fairness for consumers. So what she did, and had to do with her senior leadership team, was engage her trustees, many of whom didn't have the skills that Beatrice talks about. And in the end, we did take that legal case, and in the end, we did have fair and orderly markets for consumers. In another role I had when I was on the exec, as well as on the board of a charity, one of our funders, sort of a financial contributor to the way in which we were funded, we believed on the basis of evidence wasn't delivering for our clients, those who are part of our mission, and our vision, and our values. So we engaged the trustees, the chair of the trustees, to see if we could take action through Parliament so that we could campaign and cap the way in which they were working, because they were in the financial services sector. So as trustees and the board and the senior leadership team, we worked together to campaign to curtail that financial services company, which is now no longer in existence. And in my role as a trustee, pure trustee, I've engaged with wonderful chairs, and chairs are very important to delivering the change that are needed for our clients, to recruit senior members of staff to deliver for clients the mission, the vision, and the value, as our values. So I think, going back to what Beatrice has said and what NCVO have announced, I think it is very important that trustees are brave in looking at how we deliver on our mission and our vision. Now, my passion and willingness to be involved as a trustee, and as you've heard, it's almost half a dozen roles that I've had, come from my background. My background is one of a guy who grew up on a council estate in Wolverhampton, who moved to London and lived in a bedsit on a council estate, and now is a homeowner. In my life, I've met and I have been part of multicultural cities and towns where migration have been serious issues and still are serious issues, where social policy remains, important for giving people opportunity in their lives, where prepayment meters was just part of who I was and what I was as a family, right? We had electricity when we had money, we didn't when we didn't. Poverty, again, we live paycheck to paycheck. The man from Provi was a real thing for us. So for me, and I could go on in many other areas, for me, to be a trustee is about, yes, people that look like me, people that came from similar backgrounds to me, who were white, black, brown. For me, it is about giving back through being a trustee with the experience I have to deliver the changes I think organizations can actually deliver for those people who are vulnerable, who are in need of support to drive change. And MPC is a great organization for measuring the impact of that change, for working in collaboration with organizations to deliver that change. Now, of course, delivering change is much easier when you kind of have some control over the political environment that you're in. Again, Beatrice has laid out very clearly the challenges that we face. When I think of this new political environment, I very much think of one thing, and one thing that many people who are slightly younger than me, much younger than me, probably don't realize. It is rare to have a Labour government. Labour governments have not been something that has existed on a regular basis through the electoral cycle. We've got one now, we had one in 97, but we didn't have one until prior to that, the 70s and so on, right? So a Labour government is very rare. What's also very rare for a Labour government, although Tony Blair had a big majority, is a massive majority of over 170 seats. And I think that gives some political operators professionally in my day-to-day work, and also in charities, some comfort that all they have to do is deal with the Labour Party. And I say to the trustees on the call, please, in helping your organisations move forward and your senior leadership team move forward, that would be one of the biggest mistakes of your life, if that's all you do. Now, we know in America, what happens in America sometimes happens over here. There's a two-party system. We have, at the moment, we have the Democrats and we have the Republicans. In the UK, and Beatrice, again, keep mentioning Beatrice's name because it's such a great presentation. We have almost like a five-party national system. We have Labour, we have the Conservatives, and Beatrice talked about them in Meltdown, but we have Reform, who are small in number in terms of parliamentarians, but big in voice in terms of national coverage and their moves in by-elections and so on. And we have the Lib Dems and we have the Greens. And of course, in the devolved parliaments, we also have SNP and Plaid Cymru. So the UK and our political landscape is changing, even with a government that has a 170-odd seat majority. And I think when you're looking at campaigning, and I mentioned America, we should just be conscious of how America is seeping into the way in which we do things here, how global is now becoming local. And when you look at, for example, Reform, I think this week or last week have announced a UK dodge. You know, we're going to cut back should they ever get close to power, and they have got seats, as you know, in various local governments. We've had the Greens talk about the price of eggs, right, which is big in the US at the moment when they talk about inflation and so on. And in an area which James mentioned, I've set up an organization, a community interest company called Black Footballers Partnership, which is the voice and support for black footballers. 40% of the owners of Premier League clubs, at least, are from America. So in terms of framing messages, we're seeing a lot of an American influence. In terms of investments, as I said, in football, we're seeing that as well. And in terms of political influence, some of you would have heard in the last 24 hours and so on about our defense spending and what that figure will be, because there's a belief, and I think it's pretty clear, America's pulling back. So what does that mean as trustees with our various causes and mission and vision? Well, if the government is spending more in one area and they do not have the growth that they would like, it means there'll be cutbacks in other areas. And we will see in the next few days, when the government announces its spending review, what the impact will be on public services and on other areas. So again, you know, as trustees, when we're sat there and we're thinking about what we do and how we do it and the products and services that we deliver, we are now faced with this ever-evolving and changing political situation and new landscape. And one other thing I'd add to that new landscape is, for, again, many trustees, when you look at the Labour Party, bring it back to domestic, 170 odd seat majority, 400 odd seats. You know, you may believe that Labour is the party of the working person. Now, yes, when Labour formed trade unions, working classes, right? But in the last election last year, Ipsos said there were more graduates voting for the Labour Party than there were working people. And if that is a movement and a change and a shift, you can see why Reform see a gap, and you can see why Labour in government, as it pursues and determines what its priorities are, is having to think very carefully around what it can deliver now, but also strategically what the next election or elections may look like. So I say all of this to say to my fellow trustees, look, you need to understand the context that we're in. And I think when you do that, and I'm sure many of you already are, you begin to understand that if you're wary and careful of the political environment, you can make a big impact. I think collaboration is key. I think your networks is vitally important in terms of delivering the change on behalf of your clients. I also think you need to look very carefully at how you have a relationship with your CEO. Your CEO is vitally important for delivering that change that you will need, and the senior leadership team. I also think insight from your clients is vital. Make sure you know who it is you're serving, because in the political environment, yes, you might have an inkling to go where your natural political alliances are, whether it be Labour, Tory, and so on. But I would suggest to you, let your clients dictate your path and your strategy, because that will be the most powerful voice you will have. Collect your data, both quantitative and qualitative lived experience. Build that into your services and your product, which you probably are already, I'm pretty sure, but also into your messaging and your campaigning. And I think from that, you will become an even more relevant, more important organization, as whatever happens in this wonderful new political landscape of ours, twists and turns, you, through your charity, through your campaigning, and through your collaborations, will be even more relevant than you were prior to. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Delroy. Again, loads in there, and preempting some of the questions that have come through around the kind of fractured political landscape and future elections and all that kind of thing. Before we come on to that, I might come back to Beatrice. We've got a question about the impact of devolution, local government reorganisation. Obviously, this is, I suppose, to a degree tied into recent local election results. But what should trustees be thinking about when thinking about the fact that there's going to be all these new metro mayors, there's all these new local authorities, there's the local kind of political landscape is shifting. How can people factor that in when you're talking about clarity and confidence, when some of this is actually quite unclear at the moment?
Yeah, I think there's still quite a lot like that remains to be seen in terms of the next steps from the white paper. I mean, I think it's what I said. It's about building those relationships on a place-based level with your metro mayors and other stakeholders who are going to be really important. And just one thing that I didn't really mention in my speech, which all of my colleagues at NCVO will be surprised because it's something I bang on about all the time. And I think it sort of is the answer to a lot of these types of problems and it's something that I think people think is slightly lacking from Keir Starmer, and that is vision. I think that vision in this game is the most important thing. If you're a politician, if you're a charity leader, if you're a trustee, it's about painting a picture of the type of society that we want to build, either on the kind of macro level. I feel like that's what people want to see from the Prime Minister that they think is lacking, or on a more micro level with some of these charities that I've seen people saying, oh, I'm from such and such a charity that's in charge of the woodland or whatever it is. The vision is so important. And I think that helps to connect with stakeholders because they understand who you are. But also, I think it's partly the answer to, there was another question in the chat because I said I wasn't going to have a look, but I was just intrigued. There was another question in the chat about how do we get ready for a greater political presence from reform? Well, you know what I think the answer to that is? We stop that from happening. And I don't feel comfortable with a future where reform is an even bigger part of our political landscape. And I think that vision of the type of country that I believe that we are, a country that is, that is committed to things like multiculturalism and sustainability and environmentalism and all of those things that progressives believe in, is so important, because I do have faith that the majority in the people in this country are also committed to those things. And I think that as civil society leaders, we have a really, really important part to play in painting that picture. So I'm not an expert on devolution, so I can't really answer the question with lots of sort of specific detail, but I would just say it's about clearly and creatively expressing who you are as an organisation and what you're trying to achieve. And I also saw that the same person said that what do we think about the fact that the rumours that DCMS is going to be abolished? Which obviously we've been hearing. Well, I've been assured that that's not happening, so let's wait and see. But I mean, I'm not a really big fan of machinery of government changes because I just think it's like tinkering around the edges, and I'm not sure I really understand what the point of it would be. But in terms of DCMS leading on civil society as a sector, if DCMS didn't exist anymore, I'd like to see that move to the Cabinet Office because I think it needs to be of central importance.
Yeah, thanks, Beatrice. It's certainly not the first time there's been rumours of
No,
changes to DCMS.
yeah. Yeah, well,
Um,
I brought it up with one of the deputy directors that I regularly speak to at DCMS, and she was like, "Oh, I've just taken out a new mortgage, so I'm not expecting to have to get a new job."
yeah. And you mentioned vision, and Delroy, you spoke about building kind of lived experience into how you articulate what you're about and what you're doing. Delroy, I suppose, do you think that when we're talking about proofing yourself against political change and having a really clear vision as a way of doing that, yeah, could you mind like thinking about how lived experience can fit into that, but also how much vision does proof an organization against those kind of political shifts and changes that we're seeing?
Do I think? I think people need to know who you are and what you stand for and where you've come from and where you're going. People need to know that. 'Cause how else do you build trust, right? And it's no, you know, if you look at what Keir did in the election or prior to the election, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, he clearly went out of his way to tell people about his background and how that fuels his vision, right? However successful people think that is, right? And we've had it from Kemi, we've had it to a certain degree from Nigel Farage, we're getting it from the Greens at the moment. They're pitching for leadership, so people know it matters. The problem we have is, are they very good storytellers? Because people have got to believe you. Trust previously used to be run through, for those of a certain vintage who are listening, 3 or 4 newspapers. You get a headline in the Sun, front page of the Times. Life was good. You felt you were getting your story across. Now there are 60+ million publishers on social media. Now you have echo chambers to the left and to the right. Politicians may have 150,000 followers, but they all tend to be of a similar ilk. People listen to the same podcast nowadays and assume that the same podcast is actually the one that is the right one to follow because it gives them all the ideas in the world. This morning, for those who can't see me, I'm trying to get myself into shape for summer. And I went for a jog and I listened to a new podcast I hadn't listened to before. And I got 2 minutes into it and I had to take the headphones off because I just felt they were talking to themselves, not talking to the nation. So I think, we've got to a point now where who to trust, what to trust, how to trust is very hard. And I do think the way in which you can start building that trust is not just having a plan for change, right? Which is great because people do like to see delivery, potholes, fantastic, right? And various other things. It's important. But how does it knit together so that when I leave our webinar, I understand exactly what they're trying to achieve and why, so I can believe it in my heart and in my soul, right? So the lived experience, yes, it does matter because it tells people who you are, but it's important to know where you're going, right? That's equally as important, if not more important, because look, we've got a cost of living crisis. It resonates a lot for a lot of people. And as I say, the Labour vote has changed. And for those people who are defined as working, whatever working means now, they're looking for someone to be on their side. And that's why I think we've got this shift from 2/3 party politics to 5/7 when you go to the devolved assemblies and so on.
Yeah, thank you, Delroy. That's really helpful. We've had some quite kind of practical nuts and bolts type questions that I think would be helpful to kind of sort of take in one go around how can trustees support organisations to build those relationships they need with new MPs, new local leaders? What are the kind of practical steps around that? How do they make sure that the organisation is being bold and really pushing on things that they should be pushing on, while making sure that they're not overstepping the kind of legal boundaries of the organisation? And I think we've got one on kind of how you measure impact around influencing work, which I'll speak to a bit at the end. But if you've got any reflection on any of those bits, Beatrice, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. Well, firstly, I saw that somebody had put in the Q&A a particular question about like how do we learn about the lobbying rules and how to approach PERDA and all of that. So I actually have a link from NCVO that I wanted to share, which is around political campaigning as a charity. So should I put that in the chat, James?
Yes, that would be really helpful.
So that everyone can see that. I mean, I see trustees and as alongside charity leaders as clearly as kind of spokespeople and advocates for the organizations that they lead. And one thing that I think is really interesting, I go into every meeting with a Labour MP or with officials in the Labour government saying this government is cut from the same cloth as people like us. Every member of the cabinet has got some kind of charity experience in their background. So you are, in terms of that kind of person to person relationship, pushing at an open door. And like I said, they want to do everything. It's about kind of the economic envelope. So I think, like, practically speaking, write to the MP of the constituency that you are in. That would be the first thing that I would do. And actually, as part of Small Charities Week, which I mentioned is coming up the week beginning the 23rd of June, we're going to have my team are doing a Write to Your MP tool for charities. So that will help you to identify who your MP is if you're not already aware, and then help you to kind of frame that introductory letter. So definitely look out for that and share that with your colleagues at the organisation. But yeah, I think definitely write to your MP. It would be a first step, and show them what you do and why it matters. And bring in that lived experience. On measuring outcomes, just to mention that because I think it's really interesting. I find that really hard. And when we're doing business planning at NCVO and we're doing our KPIs, all the other team have got like huge long lists of KPIs, and every KPI that someone suggests for me, I'm like, oh no, I don't want to be held to that. How many MPs am I going to, how many questions am I going to get MPs to ask in Parliament about our issues, or how many mentions of NCVO will there be in Hansard? And obviously, like, we're a big national charity, but it is still really hard. And however hard you try, it's not a measure of how hard you tried, right? So that's really difficult. So yeah, I don't really have the answer on that one. I think one thing that I think alighted on the KPI for my team, which I feel like I'm quite jammy that I got everyone to agree to this, but about how many meetings that we have. So we have a lot of meetings with officials, and we do get quite a lot of meetings with MPs, but that's kind of what we're doing. So I guess maybe around measuring the relationships that you've developed over a year, but it is really difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. We at NPC work with quite a few kind of organisations to help them think about measuring their impact. And when it comes to influencing, it varies so much based on the type of organisation. Like, for example, NCVO, I'm sure, get a reasonable number of Hansard mentions.
Like when I was in the Refugee
yeah.
Council for the year leading, so I've just been at NCVO for nearly a year, and I was at Refugee Council for the year before, and it was the Rwanda bill time, and we were hugely involved in that, and absolutely, like, I think Refugee Council had a massive impact, and Ember Solomon, who's the chief exec, was one of the he was the go-to spokesperson on that issue. And obviously in the end there was a general election, and the big thing was that we persuaded Labour to say that they wouldn't bring it in when they came, if and when they came into government. So that kind of died. And, we could say we did that or we played a part in doing that. But it wasn't really, firstly, it wasn't just us, it was a coalition of other organizations that we worked with, but also it was about like public mood and the politics of it and all of that type of thing. So it is really hard to measure impact.
Yeah. And sometimes it's just about you can measure how many of the right kinds of things you're doing. Like it can be hard to, like you say, kind of attribute impact, but you can measure how many letters you're sending to MPs, how many meetings you get if you get meetings, how much of the right stuff
I've
you're
got
doing.
a database that can spit out, 650 letters, like right to every MP every day if I wanted to. Anyway.
But yeah, I think what that looks like will vary massively depending on the size of the organization, where you're working, what you're doing. But yeah, God, Delroy, do you?
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the bonuses, I guess, of having a government that has such a large majority is they have a lot of backbenchers who are twiddling their thumbs and are desperate for campaigns to take forward. So I think for those trustees who are working with their senior leadership teams to influence what's happening in Parliament and what's happening in the country, there are a lot of backbenchers who will need some form of work to be doing alongside their constituency casework. So I think, if you are thinking, how do I even make a start? I mean, Beatrice is right about letters to the MP, but you think of the data you're collecting, how it relates to specific areas, and that will give you a profile and an influence that you've perhaps not thought about. So when I was at one of the charities, we used to collect data from across the country, and we used to create maps for places around the country, and that would allow us to target individual MPs. So that automatically meant that when you wanted to speak to someone in the northeast or the northwest or the southeast or the southwest, whatever the political party, you had something unique to tell them about the people that they are representing in their various constituencies. And that often led to parliamentary questions and so on, and input. In terms of measuring impact, I mean, in the policy space, I think in the political space, I think it is very difficult. However, as a trustee, what I've very much lent on is you want the organisation to sing with one voice. So I think it's how you get the organisation to vote, and this is where campaigns do come in. Because if you do have a campaign across whether it be the environment or whether it be around poverty or whether it be about welfare reform or whatever it might be, that allows you then to help knit an organisation, which often, depending on the size of it, can work in silos, knit it together over a key focus. And I think that's one way of, I guess, making it more real and tangible. So as I said, when we had a legal campaign, that meant working across various departments. A step change, we had a lobbying campaign, again, that meant working across, people who were dealing with the phone calls and the debt advice to people who were doing the policy and those who were the external affairs face of it all. So you can get an organisation to work together in order to achieve those big goals. And particularly going back to the original question around vision, that then allows you to build a vision or deliver on your vision across organisation, and that allows you then to build your influencing capacity.
Yeah, I think we've had a question come in actually, again, kind of coming back to that vision point, and maybe a couple of questions that I'll try and take together. One is, how do you balance having that really clear long-term vision with relatively short-term kind of political cycles? And I think kind of related to that is, how do you balance national level influencing with kind of grassroots and community-led advocacy efforts and campaigns? I suppose my reflections on the first one are, if you've got that strong kind of articulated vision that we spoke about at the beginning, and we spoke about kind of insulating yourself against some of the political kind of winds of change by having that really strong, well articulated vision and purpose, and they aren't necessarily you don't need to and shouldn't change your kind of vision and purpose just because there's a political change. But Yeah, don't worry. What do you think about those two?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I don't know the ins and outs of this, so forgive me if anyone's on the call who does. But I can't imagine organisations like Age UK felt that when there was a new government coming in, they'd have to be defending their clients, their groups' views on the winter fuel allowance, right? So they would have had they would have had their plans for the manifesto. They would have fed those into various political parties, and then came this government policy change on the winter fuel allowance, and they would have looked at how that one line, which impacted many people, or would have impacted many people, and may still do, depending on where we are with the policy, how that one line impacts its overall broader messaging or strapline for protecting older people, let's say. So I think, you have to be a bit agile if you can, depending on the size and the resources, you have to be a bit agile because one issue can undermine your strategic goals. And let's play that into this new political landscape. It's not often that a new government comes in, makes a big swing on a policy announcement, and then several months later, he's having to change it, quite publicly change it, right? And that might point to, again, Beatrice's point around, if you don't have clarity around who you are, what your vision is, then you end up making these short-term tactical decisions. So to trustees out there, again, it's and as a trustee, we're always wary of supporting the CEO, SLT, with its strategy and its clear goals and those regular board meetings and maybe emergency board meetings, which I'm sure Age UK had, for making sure you stick to that long-term strategy. Because if you don't, you'll be buffeted left, right, and centre, and before you know it, no one knows what you stand for anymore. That is the worst case. That's the worst thing that anyone would want.
Thanks, Delroy. Beatrice, did you want to come in?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Sorry, what were you going to say, James?
I was saying for the last few minutes, do you want to put on
just a couple of minutes. And I don't have the answer. I think if I did, I would be like the Prime Minister.
You're nearly there, Beatrice. You're nearly there. Nearly there.
It's really hard, and I just a couple of points that I'd just like to make. Firstly, I'm a deep green, and I feel like a lot of people with similar politics to me, probably the majority of people on this call are like deeply committed to environmental policy, environment, sustainability. Politics is all about pragmatism, isn't it? And that's what is so difficult because with things like climate change, the solutions are not short term, and it's really, really hard. And that's why we see leaders, failing basically to make those big long-term decisions. And really interesting, I listened this morning when I was out on a run, I was listening to, again, to mention podcasts, my fave podcast, The News Agents, and they were talking about the Defence Review, and they had George Robertson on. And, what the government is now having to do is to increase spending on defence in the long term, but there will be for something which is that we kind of need now, because if there's gonna be a hot war, we need increased defence spending now. So I do think it's very difficult to manage those things, and I think with environmental organisations, often it's been about pointing to the small changes that people can make in their lives, even though we know that those are not necessarily the things that add up to the big change that is required, but it's about giving people agency in that change, basically, isn't it? Because otherwise it can just seem really, really overwhelming. And I remember when I was at DEFRA, like 100 years ago, we really wanted to ban plastic bags. And everyone said, oh, but it doesn't really matter. Plastic bags are not that bad and paper bags are worse and blah, blah, blah. We were like, no, it's a totemic issue. This signals to people that we want to take this strategy for change. none of this is particularly joined up in terms of my brain dump at this particular moment. But the other thing that I wanted to say, which goes back to my point about vision, which I've never really heard anybody say anything which has resonated with me as much, and this possibly says something about me as like a mum. But I remember a colleague of mine when I was a special advisor, and I was talking to some number 10 special advisors who were like the real gurus, and they said, so this is under Blair, and they said, we're a government that wants everybody to be able to have a washing machine in their own home. And I just think that that is kind of golden, because it was such a clear, I mean, that's vision, right? That's a clear objective that just resonates with everybody. And this was, 20 years ago. So it was less common then for everybody to have a washing machine. But it's still something I think that's quite aspirational. I think that yeah, I just think that it's like golden nuggets like that help. And it could be something that you've learnt from one of your clients or whatever it is. But I think that that type of thing really helps to bridge the gap between the short-term political cycle and the big picture.
Thanks, Beatrice. And as someone just put in the chat, yeah, it's storytelling fundamentally. We are very, very nearly out of time. So I think all that's left is to say a massive thank you to you, Delroy and Beatrice, for some great presentations and answering some quite tricky questions. If there are any topics anyone would like to hear about, please do pop them in the chat. And also a big thank you to the Clothworkers Foundation again. And the next event of this series is on Tuesday the 8th on achieving impact in a challenging financial context. So definitely connected to today. There is a feedback survey that will pop up right at the end when we finish. But I will end on, yes, another big thank you to you, Delroy, and to you, Beatrice.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Well done, James. Great presentation. Great chairman.
Thank you both.
Cheers. Bye-bye.